at Queen Street United Methodist Church in downtown Kinston, North Carolina. Welcome to our Wesley Bible class. Today we're going to be going over chapter 27 of the book of Numbers. And some of these things have had profound influence on the way property rights and things like that were determined in this country in modern times, relatively modern times, comparatively. So let's get into that. In chapter 26, there was an allocation. They were talking about how the land was going to be allocated once they conquered it. Okay, how it was going to be divvied up among the tribes. And then they mentioned not just the primary tribal patriarch, but they were mentioning also the sons of the patriarch and how they would be divvying up sublots of the land. Okay, now there was a problem with the property of Zelophehad, and the problem with Zelophehad is that he had no sons. Okay, and now he's dead, and all he's got is daughters. So the question is, can a woman inherit property?
Probably not.
Well, let's just see what God says about that, okay? Then the daughters of Zelophehad came forward. Zelophehad was the son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, of the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. The names of his daughters were Mahlah, Noah, interesting name, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the leaders and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the congregation of those who gathered themselves against the Lord in the congregation of Korah, but died for his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us possession among our father's brothers." Okay? So what they're arguing is that the property rights should not devolve to their uncles. They should devolve to them. Okay? Direct descendants. Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "The daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers, and pass the inheritance of their father on to them. You shall also speak to the Israelites, saying, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan. He shall possess it. It shall be for the Israelites a statute and ordinance as the Lord commanded Moses." So how about that? Okay, now, what is going on? What's going on is there is a strict prohibition that property rights will not pass outside of the family. Okay, that is a primary principle. Okay, the fact that that family consists of daughters is not going to preclude that property from being passed on. We make reference all the time to, going to Williamsburg and finding out how things were in colonial times. This is exactly how property was passed on in colonial America. Okay, and there was a big deal back then that a widow inherited her husband's property, okay, and legally was responsible for everything associated with that property, including its management, okay, but she did not have the right to vote. And she brought a case that she should have the right to vote since she had all of the responsibilities that a man would have.
Could she sell it?
She could.
Once she inherited the debts.
She also inherited the debts. That's right. So, I'm not sure, how did that turn out? I think they allowed her the right to vote. I think they did. They had a play about it in the museum. And really well acted, very well acted, but it was she was arguing with her brother over whether or not she should have the right to vote because she was the owner of the property. You could vote in colonial America if you were white, male, property owner, and free. Okay, and your property had to be more than so many acres. Okay, so very few people in colonial America could vote. Okay, you had to be 21 too. But you couldn't, I mean, one of the things they do is when you get in the courthouse, they say, okay, everybody raise your hand, and everybody raises their hand. Okay, we're going to go over voting rights. Okay, you have to be white, and then you have to be male. By the time we got done with it, it was
You
like
were the only person.
it was like out of a crowd of 50 people, you might have 5 that could vote. So I mean, renters don't count. So it's very interesting. Now, how does this play out also in terms of an understanding of property? Property, in Old Testament understanding, property has to do with salvation. Okay? We look at salvation very differently today. It's an individual thing. You're forgiven of your sins and you're saved and on your way to heaven and all that. Back then, salvation was wrapped up in whether or not the right people occupied the promised land. So that's what salvation constituted, the fact that God endorsed them being in their land.
So just the Israelites.
Yes, that's correct. Salvation,
That's a lot of responsibility and
Well-
not really fair. I mean, how can you, that's a lot to be in charge of and for your salvation.
yes, it is. And that's, okay, let's go way back, okay? Adam and Eve. What did God tell Adam and Eve to do?
Not
With the
fair.
land.
Take care of the land.
Be fruitful, multiply.
Be fruitful and multiply, okay? And take care of the land. All right, so then the devil comes along and says, hey, you could eat the fruit of this tree and you could be just like God. Who is God? God is the property owner. So from the standpoint of an Old Testament point of view, the sin of Adam and Eve is trying to appropriate God's property rights. And that's why they were kicked out of the garden. And you have a whole series of stories in both the Old Testament and the New Testament that have to do with bad tenants, okay, and property rights. Naboth's vineyard that Ahab wanted, okay. Ahab wanted to buy Naboth's vineyard, but he wasn't in the family. And Naboth said, no, you can't because you're not in the family. And the king went back and said, no, well, I'm not in the family. I really can't do this. And Jezebel said, oh, yes, you can. What if he doesn't have a family? Okay? And so she offs the guy. So, and that was a big deal. That was one of the primary reasons why Jezebel and Ahab were killed, was because of this theft of property. There is in Isaiah a story that God is talking to his people and saying, I gave you this land to tend and you did not tend it and you weren't good and I'm going to give it to somebody else. Okay, that was in Isaiah. Guess who picked up on that parable? It's Jesus picked up on that parable, talking about, as Creighton talked about, in the sermon a few weeks ago, that you're bad tenants, and what you're trying to do is to own the property. Okay, these people, while they talk about property rights as ownership and things like that, in reality, the people of God are considered renters. That the land actually belongs to God. Okay, so God has a restrictive clause that if you mess up, I'm going to take my property back. Okay, so this is something that impacts us.
It's a theme.
It's a theme. It's a theme that carries over to today on property rights. okay? But the main thing was you could not sell property outside of the family. It had to stay in the clan in order for it to be a legitimate practice. If property was transferred outside of the clan, then there was a year of Jubilee, and during the year of Jubilee, not only were slaves, Israelite slaves, freed, okay, but property was restored to the original owner. So you could buy a piece of property, but you couldn't have it past the year of Jubilee.
But what you were saying about salvation, again,
Yeah.
how, is it like a group of people and their salvation, or your individual salvation?
Salvation was looked at more as a group thing, and if you'll notice in everything that we've been looking at in the Old Testament, there are instances where an individual is punished, okay? Moses is about to be. But the penalty for an individual sin transmits to the group. So everybody is responsible for what one sinner does. You know, it reminds me of basic training. When one guy screwed up, the rest of us would have to get down and do 50, okay?
Wow.
So
And that's nothing like we believe today or know today. I mean,
we look at it much more individually,
yeah.
okay? But salvation was not considered, even in New Testament times and in the early church, salvation was not viewed as an individual thing necessarily, okay? If the head of the household was a Christian, then everyone in the household was considered a Christian and subject to Roman law as a result of that. So everybody could be punished, including slaves. Everyone in the household who was under a patriarch who was Christian would forfeit their life just like the patriarch would. And that's one of the reasons why we do infant baptism, and the church always has, is that we look at salvation as a shared responsibility within the family.
Okay. Mhm. Okay.
Okay? All right. So, yeah, it's both. It's both,
Right.
okay?
Because we're supposed to spread Christianity.
Yes.
I mean, we're supposed to go forth and tell, that's our responsibility.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
It is our responsibility, and where does it start? It starts in your own house. Okay? As I explained a little of this when I did my great-granddaughter's baptism to the congregation, okay? That we baptize infants because we understand that this is a family responsibility for salvation. And that's why you can make a promise on behalf of this child, okay? And I explained why we do infant baptisms. So, yes, it's an individual responsibility, but it is also a shared responsibility. I also mentioned that, you could marry, if you are married to someone outside of the faith, okay, then your responsibility is not to leave that person, your responsibility is to convert that person. So that's kind of how it works, all right?
Then the congregation makes a pledge too.
Yes, the congregation makes the pledge too, because they are the wider family of God. So in infant baptisms, we accept the responsibility for that child, all of us collectively, okay? Because baptism, in our understanding, is a ritual of adoption. This child is adopted into the family of God, and the family says, yes, we're responsible,
okay, yeah.
okay?
And back to the land, even here in America, these big family farms, they're proud of the fact that land's been in their family for And it's expected of the next son
Yes,
to farm that land and
yes. And the government considers it its responsibility to
subsidize.
make sure the family can't inherit that property.
It's the truth.
They'll load so many taxes on it that the family will have to sell it in order to satisfy the government. So, yeah,
Or they'll run a highway through it.
well, they run a highway through it, yeah. Something like that. And I think we're about to get some of that. Okay? Yeah. The government is almost godlike in that they consider all property belongs to the government first. Okay, which, by the way, is not constitutional. I mean, really, when the founding fathers would have been absolutely abhorred at the idea of eminent domain on the part of the government.
What's the Constitution?
It's something they wrote, a couple hundred years ago. Anyway. All right, now let's see what happens to Moses. The Lord said to Moses, "Go up to this mountain of Abarim range and see the land that I have given to the Israelites. When you have seen it, you shall be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was." You're going to die. Okay? And why? Because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness of Zin. When the congregation quarreled with me, you did not show my holiness before their eyes at the waters. These are the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint someone over the congregation who shall go before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep without a shepherd." All right, drop back a little bit. Moses is going to die not because he is old. Moses is going to die not because he was part of the generation that rebelled. Okay? Moses is going to die because he didn't perform at the waters of Meribah the way God instructed him to perform. Now,
Sky Patty.
here's a guy who, remember when he married this woman from Africa? Okay? And Aaron and Miriam got all bent out of shape about it? Okay? And God said, "There is nobody more humble than Moses. He can do whatever he wants." Okay? So God's going to take this humble guy up the mountain, and he's going to die there as a punishment, not as a natural event, not because he's old, but because he just didn't, he didn't follow instructions. On one occasion. Now, there have been several occasions where Moses did not follow instructions, as we have seen. Okay? We saw that in chapter 26, or 25. But for this thing, he's going to die. So this really good man with a huge, wonderful record, who has been able to speak directly to God all this time, okay, he's going to die as a punishment. I don't know. It just doesn't seem quite right. You'd think there would be some consideration, but no. No, there's not going to be any consideration. He's going to die, and he's going to die because he messed up. Okay? Now, what does it mean that he's going to be gathered to his people? What does that say about an Old Testament understanding of life after death? Because ultra-Orthodox thinking is that there is no life after death, okay? But he's going to be gathered to his people, suggesting that there's going to be some kind of a relationship with his people after he dies.
What does that mean?
Well, I don't know. I don't know, but evidently, death is not, even in an Old Testament understanding, death is not an obliteration of the person. There is a place called Sheol, somewhere dark, underground, not pleasant, but a place of the dead where they're, I don't know, they hang out. You know, and evidently they hang out with each other because he's going to his people. People have been, in the Old Testament, brought back from the dead. Samuel was brought back from the dead through a divination of a witch at Saul's request. So, and then you have on the Mount of Transfiguration, who shows up? Elijah and Moses, you know? And so where did they come from? They evidently were not obliterated. So there's something going on after death, but in the Old Testament it is not well defined. Okay? Now, why is there a reluctance on the part of these people to give definition to what it's like in a life after death? Understand that Christianity has really made this a central theme. Okay? Life after death, heaven, hell, vivid descriptions, read Dante and all that stuff. Okay? So we're really focused on this life after death. These people are not. And the reason they are not is that this grand description of life after death is an Egyptian concept. And they hate everything Egyptian. So they're not going to do the same thing that the Egyptians did. They're not going to have all these hoops you got to jump through in order to get to the thing and get yourself mummified and all these kinds of things. Okay? As far as they're concerned, the faster they get that person in the dirt, the better. You know, you're buried by sundown. And, you know, that's the way it is. And, you know, death is not seen as something grand and vivid and wonderful. It's seen as something that contaminates the land if you don't get rid of the corpse real quick. So they don't have the same perception of like we do, of preservation of the body and all of that. We look at preservation of the body because we're thinking about the day of resurrection when, you know, all of a sudden that embalmed thing is going to come up out of the ground and be transformed. That's one of the reasons why we do all of that, because of that understanding of the last day when the dead will rise. Well, you don't want to be, you know, just putrefied ashes and stuff, and that, you know, just, you know. Okay, we have a sense that there's something else that's going to happen with us beyond, and that's one of the reasons we go through all the funerary things that we do. They did not have that. They did not have that. And they didn't want a central theme of their religion as being a preparation for life after death. Their central theme is life in the promised land. How about that? Okay.
So the bottom line of being gathered by his people, or to your people, is, I mean, what are we saying?
We don't know.
We don't know.
That's what I'll get waiting, we don't know.
That's right.
So was he supposed to be encouraged by that, or?
Well, let's look at his response. His response is, oh, well, if that's going to happen, then we need to have somebody else in charge.
Interesting.
He doesn't protest.
Maybe Moses was held more accountable because he was in direct communication with God.
Yes, I think that's probably so. But Moses also, because Moses knew God that well, he wasn't going to stand there and argue with him about it. Okay? Plus which, he has often asked God, please kill me, don't let me lead these people. Okay?
Yeah.
So he's looking, this is my retirement, you know? He's not looking at it as, you know, it's like throw me in that briar patch. So
So he is encouraged.
yeah, it doesn't frighten him.
Okay.
It doesn't frighten him at all. And, I mean, if I die as a result of God wanting to punish me, I have a pretty good idea that I'm not going that way. I'm going that way, But he didn't have that because there was no dichotomy
Right, he did,
of
right,
heaven and hell
Right.
in his mind.
right.
Okay? So he wasn't afraid of it. It was just, for him, it's like, oh, finally, got some relief. But he says somebody needs to lead the people. Now, there's some interesting things that happen because this leadership is fundamentally transformed from the way Moses did it, okay, or the way God viewed leadership under Moses. So the Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit," which means he's charismatic, okay, "and lay your hand upon him," which we still do in ordination, okay? "Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and all the congregation and commission him in their sight. You shall give him some of your authority, so that all the congregation of Israel may obey. But he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire for him by the decision of the Urim before the Lord. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the Israelites with him, the whole congregation." So Moses did as the Lord commanded. He took Joshua and had him stand before Eleazar the priest and the whole congregation. He laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord had directed through Moses. All right. I have been commissioned 3 times. Okay? I got commissioned as a second lieutenant by the Army. Okay? Nixon signed my commission. Okay? I got commissioned by the governor of North Carolina in the North Carolina National Guard. Okay?
Which one was that?
Huh?
Who was that? Which one?
Is it Hunt?
I think it was Hunt.
I think I'm confused.
No, I think it was Martin who was there when I was commissioned in the Guard. Okay. Then I've been commissioned by the bishop. So I've had 3 commissionings. Okay. Joshua's commissioning is really interesting because it's very conditional. Does he have the authority that Moses had? No.
Give him some of your authority.
Give him some of your authority.
That's a mouthful.
Yes. Okay, so what's going on here? All of a sudden, instead of having a central authority, Moses was never a king, but he operated like one. Moses had more insight into what God wanted than his brother Aaron the priest, and would from time to time override Aaron the priest. Okay, now understand, this section here, this is all by the priestly writers.
Yeah.
Okay, you can see their hand in this. Okay, so Joshua is charismatic. So Joshua has the Spirit, but Joshua might be wrong. And so he needs to be fact-checked by Eleazar the priest. Joshua has command authority. He is the military leader. He is the civil leader. Okay? He is not the spiritual leader. Eleazar is the spiritual leader. And the spiritual leader can veto anything that Joshua comes up with. And how does Eleazar know whether or not what Joshua is inspired to do is correct? He does it with Urim. U-R-I-M. What is that?
Dice.
Dice, exactly. The Urim and Thummim are the dice that the high priest has to decide what
Wow.
God wants done. So it's a toss of the dice. whether or not he has any actual authority.
It seems like God is starting to take more of a distant approach. I mean, he had conversations with Moses.
He trusted Moses, but he doesn't trust Joshua so much.
So he's now not going to have, it doesn't seem like going to have these conversations with Joshua or Eleazar.
Right. And
So-
what has been the tradition, even in modern monarchies, about who puts the crown on the head of the king?
The,
Archbishop?
The Archbishop.
Of Canterbury?
Yeah, the Archbishop of Canterbury in Britain, okay? In other countries where there's a monarchy, the crown is placed by whoever the religious leader is in that country, okay? So you see this same thing transmitting even to today, that yes, I'll put the crown on your head, but if it needs to come off with your head,
But yeah, looking at it from my standpoint, if God was not going to speak with them directly, then I think two heads are better than one.
okay, and what we are seeing is a principle that we have followed, not as well as could be, but a principle of division of power, that no one has absolute authority in the government, okay? And while Eleazar might have fact-check authority, he still is not a commander of the troops. Okay, so division of power is something that we embraced as a principle in our own country, and we've divided it even more. Because we don't trust anybody,
As we shouldn't.
as we shouldn't.
but
Okay,
you know, I think that God can, God's thinking, you can roll the dice all you want to.
Mhm.
But, I'm in charge.
yes,
I mean,
bottom line, God is in charge, okay? And you can't just have, I mean, the world has been plagued by charismatic authority,
amen.
okay? So we can't have that unchecked.
So you can imagine in times of crisis, the clash.
If you want to see a classic example of how that works or doesn't, take a look at the clash between Samuel and Saul.
Yeah.
And this is precisely what happens, okay? And quite frankly, I'm on Saul's side. I like Saul a whole lot more than I like Samuel. So anyway, just take a look at that. But you can see where these Old Testament passages have had a profound effect on modern society. They really have. And we've only been able to dump some of this stuff, like the legitimacy of genocide and things like that. We've only been able to dump some of that stuff in very, very, very modern history.
Right.
Okay?
Slavery.
Yeah, slavery, the whole thing. Okay, well, mull that over, and we'll see you next week, okay? Welcome, and thank you very much for being here. If you want to contact me, you know where you can find me. All right.